ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me like this? So I gave to my talk this kind of provocative title without wanting to be provocative, but there is something in the relation of design and modern art which kind of makes me think a lot about a change in the relation of the objects, and I will try to develop around experiences out of my own professional life and the spaces where I'm moving about this, to reflect about this experience and perhaps come to conclusions and to leave it as an open field for discussion what's happening right now, and that we just become more aware about that. So working in the environment of Waddesdon Manor, which is a pure Victorian house filled with French treasures from the 18th century, I'm always fascinated to see that the present Lord Rothschild, who is still in charge, really is like a mad, he's in his 80s, but he is still of this generation who wants to construct this provocation. So he brings in an Easter egg of Jeff Koons into our wonderful winter garden, which is in itself a wonderful place. So here it's kind of new design, an incredible artwork, which we all know, but in a kind of provocative setting of this absolutely intact winter garden with original plants. I can tell you in Germany we don't have winter gardens like this. In England they have them, but apparently you have to display them like this. Another wonderful scene which makes shiver the curator, who am I for furniture, is to have Naomi Campbell displaying her beauty on our Victorian dining room chairs. Again, something which was publicized with the pleasure of his lordship, and then publicized in Vogue magazine. So this is for me, and I could show you endless images of what people associate with historic places and historic art. One of the most wonderful things I saw, I didn't put into this presentation, was one of those sparsely dressed young models sitting on a Louis XVI little canapé, and I found that on a billboard in Times Square. I mean, how can you come from the boudoir of Louis XVI's period to Times Square? There are questions for me which raise and which I would like to find out. Is it ignorance? Is it bashing French style or historic styles, or is it purely provocation? So these are things which I kind of kicked off my reflection for today's talk. When we look at creations from European history of art and of design history, everybody thinks of France. I'm a specialist in French decorative arts of the 18th and 19th centuries, so I have to show you one of those wonderful objects, which is today in the Jean-Paul Getty Museum, was before in the Rothschild collection in Vienna, and probably produced as a private commission for a Polish count who ordered that from the architect Nicolas Pinault in Paris, high Rococo style. And it's probably one of the most beautiful corner cabinet objects which were made at that time. Now, this is a very complex object. We are very lucky to know about the designer, the architect. There's a drawing which is existing in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris for that object. We know about the maker of the wooden carcass, who is Jacques Dubois, who signed the thing. And we have ideas about the bronze maker, who might be somebody like Caffieri. So it's a very constructed and very nicely made object. You have to know that in order to make an object like this, you could not, as the cabinet maker, do the bronzes. You had to go to a special bronze maker, and you could, as a bronze maker, not do the wooden carcass. You need to have the architect who kind of really overviews the whole thing, and for that there was this incredible job of the Marchand Mercier, on which I will come in a second. But this is kind of the prime quality design object of the 18th century. If we come to the regal level and show you one of the most refined rooms ever made in France at the very end of the 18th century, Le Boudoir of Marie Antoinette in the Château de Fontainebleau, 1787. The walls are actually silvered and painted with arabesque painting. The mahogany floor has been made by Bernard Molitor, the artist and topic of my PhD, and the furniture is made by Jacob and by Weisweller. So it's kind of the highest level of craft and court design realized for the French queen. But when you see that there's an incredible amount of skill organization and structuring which came into play. It's a very complex conception. Same with a single object for that little table, which was found some years ago in a kind of washing room in San Francisco, brought back to the world and sold in New York at Sotheby's or Christie's. It's one of the very few still existing and very priceless objects by Martin Carlin, another fantastic designer and maker from the 18th century in Paris. And I show this to you because in the photographs they do in these catalogs, you can very nicely see you have a wooden structure, of course, then you have these fantastic porcelain plaques, and of course the bronze frame to keep it all in place. Now this is an object which no cabinet maker and no porcelain manufacturer could have made. They needed to have a collaboration which was very densely organized in a very urban surrounding like you would find on Manhattan in the early 19th century, where you have somebody who is a supervisor, who was the so-called marchand mercier, the art dealer and art manager. He made the design and he would go to the bronze maker and say, I need that frame, and then he would have the privilege as the only maker to go to Sèvres, to the porcelain manufacturer, which was owned by the king, to say, I need these tiles, and they need to be this shape. And they pushed that extravaganza in making these perfect objects to such a way that those tiles, which in the beginning of that fashion were simply square, flat tiles, became all kind of funny shapes, as you can see here already, and they would even become bent in the end. So which is really like showing in how far those craftsmen who were working in this framework of the guilds, where everybody knew exactly what he was allowed to do. The bronze maker was only allowed to do the bronzes, the cabinet maker was only allowed to make the wooden structures and nothing else, and the porcelain manufacturer, of course, worked under the protection of the king, and they could do something very elaborate, but it was the marchand mercier who brought it all together. Now, in the second part of the 18th century, before the revolution, one observes that there was in the European competition for economic development and really like merchandise. There was in the beginning industrialization, there was a great big aim of actually nationalizing style or giving many people a kind of fair amount of good education. And there is one institution, we saw just this wonderful talk by Dr. Ehrlich about Marchioni, but what was happening in Paris in the later 18th century and also in London were these drawing schools, which were not aimed as the Accademia di San Luca as a kind of corporation or a guild, but actually schools which would educate a number of students in order to allow them to make appropriate design which would be sellable on an international, national, and of course more and more international market. Now, when the École Royale de Gratuite de Dessin was founded by Jacques Bachelier, who was an academic painter, he found a great deal of opposition from the establishment of the artists and the academies, and he really had to push this project through the protection of Madame Pompadour and the king, and he managed to get all the accreditations which would allow to establish for the first time in European history a design school where young boys were trained to do perfect designs which will follow the new style, which was of course no longer the Louis XV style and Rococo, which I showed you with Nicolas Pineau, but which would become what we call today neoclassical style. Okay, so they were formed, and in this wonderful drawing in the Musée Carnavalet, let me tell you, there were 4 sessions every day, and in every session they would train 125 students. It's an amazing aim to really popularize a national neoclassical French style. So there was kind of a beginning of a standardization of a style, of giving them all the best educational possibilities, and that system of the mass education was strongly opposed by the academies and the establishment of the arts. So that's very interesting. We have Diderot and Voltaire who write in favor of the school, and the school was very interesting. We were just talking before the session about gender question. If there wouldn't have been the French Revolution, there would have been a school for girls. The big problem was that you wouldn't be able in 18th century France, obviously, to educate boys and girls together because things would happen which would not be liked to be seen. So the girls' school was organized in a nuns' monastery, and the girls would be taken personally from their homes and brought to the school by the nuns. So this is a very interesting project. The premises were reserved. The school was already fitted with all you need in a school. The revolution happened and it became a military place. So over with this. It would take another 60 years to found the first public drawing school for girls in the 19th century. It's a very interesting topic. So design was international from the beginning. And when I show you two chairs here, it's very interesting. The one in the black and white is a chair by George Jacob, made in Paris in the 1780s. There is also a print which goes with that chair. It was on the art market in the 60s in New York. And believe it or not, the kind of clumsy version of it on the left-hand side is by a German architect who worked in Berlin and who had been in Paris in the early 1790s. So he obviously saw Langhans saw this chair and the design, and he was aware of it, and he made that kind of interpretation of a French design in Berlin just at the same time or some years later. Now, this is something we observe very, very often, that already in the pre-jet age or pre-train age, ideas can move pretty fast. It's also something interesting when you look at today's kind of looking at very proto-modern or not regarding history, is that when you actually study history and you study history of design, you're sometimes astonished in how far some Renaissance designs or some late 18th century designs or early 19th century kind designs could look like proto-modern. And I show you here chairs by Bernard Molitor that were designed in the 1790s, and they could just come out of a Bauhaus manual in a way. And of course they are not Bauhaus because they're handmade and they are very elaborate with these mahogany incrustations. But it's fascinating to see in how far this kind of design would look like proto-modern. Same thing here with a Guéridon, which copies an antique model which was designed by Molitor in about 1800. Which is a design which could be dated in a much later period. So that for the kind of idea that historic design, or as sometimes it was called when I was here in New York, I heard this term of brown furniture, is not really appropriate and pays no tribute to those. It's very disrespectful to the people who designed these incredible objects more than 200 years ago. The evolution in Europe from the crafted kind of old-fashioned cabinet maker's chair, I show you on the right-hand side, to the proto-modern design with the bentwood by the Tonnet brothers on the left screen, is illustrated by that chair, which we call normally the balloon chair. It's an 1820s, 1830s model of a kind of neo-rococo design, the cane chair on the right screen. And then at the same time, you have these industrialization, the idea of industrialization, who brings forward, takes these designs, but brings them forward in a way which will have an incredible impact for industrial manufacture of furniture as we still know it today. Now, in the term of the 19th century, we have the phenomena of kind of democratization and money becoming more available. And you didn't need to be Bavarian King Louis II to build yourself a fairy tale castle like Neuschwanstein on the left-hand screen. You could also be a filthy rich banker's descendant, like a Baron Rothschild, and build yourself a manor as the one on the right-hand screen, which is still up and perfectly kept up, and the collections are outstanding. So that's the kind of social evolution of democratization, which brings the banker baron to build an 18th century castle in the English countryside with a French architect with French stone, which was brought there, and makes the Bavarian king build himself a copy of a medieval castle with electric generators and the first telephone line in Bavaria to the neighboring castle to speak with Mama. Okay, so it's very interesting how those ideas can shift. Now, the interiors of those houses can be in different style, and of course the proliferation of material excess and industrialization brought up interiors such as the one I show you on the screen. This is the Green Room in Linderhof, another castle for Ludwig II, where actually this profusion of material and style really personifies or illustrates very well how that kind of over profusion of material created the need for something else, which would come up with the foundation of the reform movement in Europe between Vienna, Darmstadt, and Weimar and Dessau in the 1910s and 1920s, and with this groundbreaking school of the Bauhaus, which after the events of the 20th century in Germany actually had to close, and made that many artists came to this country where they actually were prolific and very successful in their presentations, in their creations. Now, what is very interesting is that while many of the historic rooms and rooms like those made for Louis II of that style were really aimed at having something like representation or social representation, or the Rothschild castle overfilled with these kind of very prestigious furniture where they wanted to relate coming in two generations from the ghetto to the hill with the castle to show their social accession. It's very interesting that the Bauhaus really comes back again to the quality of the workshop, to skill, and to also the idea of the craft. And in that sense, it's very interesting to confront a Guéridon, which dates from about 1790, 1800, which is coming from the collections of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and concerns studies of color schemes. He wrote lots of books on colors. And then you come to the master buildings on the right-hand screen in the Dessau settlement for the teachers' houses, and you see those wonderful color schemes on the staircase, which were reconstructed in the last 10 years, and you realize in how far these ideas, which were thought to be very modern in the 30s, actually were already topic of thinking of some philosophers like Diderot or Kant or Voltaire or Goethe in the early 19th century. Now, the same idea for the technical improvement and industrial production of furniture. You saw the Viennese chair, which I showed you, the coffee house chair by the Tonnet brothers, which the technique would be improved, would be transformed from wood to tubular steel or tubular metal, and be creative with these incredible furniture classics by Marcel Breuer and others, which were designed for the Bauhaus. So again, something which emulates or develops very organically from something which comes straight from the craft. And we have today a kind of fusion or explosion. I mean, this is again a presentation from Waddesdon Manor. Ingo Maurer, who creates these porca miserias, which are explosions of cheap china. It's not Sèvres and it's not Meissen which they explode. But again, it's the provocative thing which fascinated Lord Rothschild, to buy that and to put it above a table which is laid out for display with Meissen or with Sèvres. Okay, this is a very successful light installation by Ingo Maurer, who is an artist who does this kind of thing since 20 years and in different forms. And then the same room in another year with a wonderful installation by the Fontana brothers. And I would like to finish on that slide, because what is very interesting is that we see today that there are many artists such as Fontana, Ingo Maurer or Jeff Koons who are really making site-specific works of art. They're making very provocative work. For example, the Fontana brothers, they work with reclaimed material, which sometimes can be very brute or very rough. But what is interesting with all these creative people is that they are interested, obviously, in objects, and they're very interested in decorative arts, what we would used to call decorative arts before, and design, and that there is another line which I'm very interested in now, and I don't have many images, but if I just quote some names for you, I would just mention Thomas Heatherwhite, who read this morning about the staircase monument he did somewhere downtown. I haven't seen yet. Lars Lahmann, who does the digital printed bridge in Amsterdam, and on whom there was a fantastic exhibition last fall at Parsons at Cooper Hewitt Uptown, and some designer by Byung-Hon Choi, who does incredible stone furniture. He's Korean, and he does sculpture, but also furniture. So it's very interesting to see these different strengths in dealing with modern design in the context of objects and of an environment. And I think we have to think about an architect who creates an environment which will be like the bridges, which will be in Amsterdam or which is somewhere else. There's a rolling bridge by Heatherwhite, which is in London, and objects like a bench which you can have in your park, and objects which you hang into your Louis XV dining room in order to provoke some reaction by a visitor. It's very interesting. And I was confronted in Waterston very often with these contrasting installations, which are a very successful installation with the visitors. But I think there's a much more serious way of looking at objects and of how they are included in contemporary creation. And what I just saw this morning coming up the staircase here, these site-specific works which are in the staircase, which are absolutely fantastic. And what I would like to know if they are still here in 50 years. That would be interesting. Thank you very much for your attention.